Okay, this weekend we're switching gears from Russia to the Ming Dynasty. So this lecture is a little bit longer, and it's going to cover objectives 31 through 33, the political, social, and economic developments of the Ming Dynasty. You should be taking notes on your handout. And also just a note that this PowerPoint in particular has a lot of words on it. And I encourage you to write down and practice that note-taking from college, where you're not going to be able to write down every word, but to only write down the most essential information and to use those shortcuts that work for you. So number this 31 through 33, title it the Ming Dynasty, and we're going to begin. So again, this simply says, make sure you record only the important information. There's also pictures I would note and keep track on your notes what these pictures are of. Okay, so our political developments of the Ming. In 1368, the Ming rulers kicked the Mongols out of China, so they end the Yuan dynasty. And they create a strong centralized government, not unlike our previous Chinese governments. They are very familiar with Confucianism and governments of the past. Again, partly this is because the Mongols have tried so hard to keep the Chinese separate that the Chinese were able to preserve their culture keep it pretty intact. So it wasn't greatly influenced. Very similar to to Russia. So the government is based on Confucius values. We have the civil service exams reinstated. We have a bureaucracy. So typically you can kind of assume in China, unless it's the Yuan dynasty under the Mongols, that there's a bureaucracy with civil service exams. The first Ming emperor wants to get totally rid of any influence or lasting effects of the Mongols. And a side question. Pardon me. What do you know about how Emperor Hongwu gained power? Based on your reading, maybe take a note here. How was he able to get rid of the Mongols? And also think about tradition and Chinese tradition. How did he gain power? So yes, this idea should remind you of Russia. Not a lot of influence left from the Mongols, and they kind of just get kicked out. So our social developments. We have a revival of the scholar gentry. So China continues to value education, and it's the scholar gentry who get the highest positions, which means we have a meritocracy. You have to earn your position in the government with the civil service exams. However, reforms are instituted that limit the power and influence of our scholar gentry group so that the emperor has the most power. This is known as Neo-Confucianism. Basically, it's Confucianism with some tweaks or some changes. The status of women remains relatively unchanged, so we continue to practice foot binding. And the Chinese are pretty excited about this development and that the Mongols are no longer in power, and so the Chinese culture is reinvigorated. Painting and literature becomes common practice again and highly valued. And our picture at the right is of a bureaucracy. Here we have some of that art that I was just referring to. And then we have some more art. One thing it's pretty typical and common of Chinese art is that it's landscapes, but with people. So a lot of like landscape paintings and nature paintings, but of the scholar gentry doing various things. Unlike in Europe, the Chinese art is oftentimes not religious in nature. And you can see, hopefully you kind of recognize the Chinese style and how it's different to, say, the European or Renaissance style. Okay, so our economic developments, we have new crops from the Americas that can be grown in inferior soil. This means like wheat and potatoes, etc. And so there's more diverse crops. Think about where these crops, how these crops might be getting from the Americas to China, because we're going to be discussing that in class, but it definitely relates to what we talked about on Thursday. And anytime there's new food and more stable food source, we're going to have population growth. And so the Chinese population grows because of a more diverse diet and more stable food. Commercially, we have overseas trading increase. The early Ming take a great interest in traveling the world and learning more about it and trade. You have Zheng He and his expeditions, which we are going to go into more detail about in class on Monday. But they're very interested in the outside world. And you have a merchant class rising. Remember, in China, the merchant class is usually the very lowest class. But because of this interest in trade and overseas trade, the Chinese merchant class is now gaining power. So, Zheng He, some economic developments. So Zheng He, as you can see on the map, travels in the early 1400s, but as a result of his travels, the late 1400s are a time of rich trade for China. Zheng He is a naval commander and a commodore, and he travels with a fleet, an armada, throughout Southeast Asia, throughout the Indian Ocean. He discovers new, etc. So this is the video that we're going to watch on Monday in class. But what's important to know is that Zheng He's explorations are motivated by diplomacy, that China wants to go and create relationships with the other regions in the Indian Ocean. They are not meant to conquer. But the other purpose that these serve are, he has this huge armada of really strong ships and really great technology, and China kind of wants to show off. They want to flex their muscles and let the rest of the Indian Ocean know, but not violently, that they are, the most dominant and the most advanced civilization in the region. So they kind of want to show off, flex their muscles, and create relationships. This is not meant to go and conquer and create colonies. And we'll, again, watch the video on Monday. So, the voyages of Zheng He create trade in the area. This relates to the Asian Sea Trading Network. So again, the Chinese could have probably become a dominant colonial power. They had the military capability and the technology, but that wasn't really their style. But then the emperor died and a new emperor stepped up and ended all these expeditions so that finances could be more focused on building a new capital and on supporting people. And so actually, as you'll see in the video, the fleet of 300 amazing ships with silk sails are burned to the ground, and China basically closes its doors to the outside world. Unfortunately. But we'll talk in class about what might have been if this had not happened, if Zheng He had not been called back home. So some more economic developments. China starts to use silver as its currency, which should make you think immediately of our most recent DBQ and the DBQ assignment 2.2. Where does the silver come from? It comes from Japan initially, but then you should think about the European conquest in the Americas and how we know about silver mines. So Japan has silver, but then the Spanish start to bring silver from the Americas, from their colonies overseas. And then we're going to see over time that too much silver starts to flood the Chinese market, which causes severe inflation and an economic almost collapse, which your DBQ is going to allude to. Okay, so maybe I moved these slides around an accident, but not so much. So the relationship with China and Europe. So China floods its markets, has an economic collapse, and after Zheng He, the China grows more isolated. Think about why that might be when you think about the influx of silver coming in, etc., and the DBQ. And Europeans established trading contacts along the coast. So Europe is definitely in the region, very interested in the region, and not trying to invade inland, but setting up contacts along the coast and port cities that they control. We also have missionaries, because anytime there's, European merchants, they bring missionaries. And missionaries are trying, but they fail to they fail to convert large sections of the population. So we introduce Christianity, but there's not mass conversions. So most people remain Buddhist or Taoist. So the fall of the Ming. The Ming falls due mostly to external problems, but again, this should remind you of the fall of Rome and the fall of most of our civilizations. Their external problems are Europeans are encroaching more and more on their trade, invading port cities, but still the Chinese aren't overwhelmingly influenced by this. They're able to keep the Europeans at a safe distance, but it does impact them. And then our internal problems are famines, peasants start to revolt, and Ming leaders become ineffective at dealing with these problems. So we see this. It's just a typical dynastic cycle, that the early dynasty is eager and wants to make all the changes. The later dynasties are ruled by people who are totally out of touch with the outside world, were raised, in a sheltered kingdom, and usually end up failing the people. So the fall of the Ming Dynasty is 1644.
Move on to the next slide.
The Ming Emperor invites the Qing warriors from Manchuria up north, that region that is highlighted in purple. And so the Ming Emperor says, hey, we would love to use some of your warriors as mercenaries. So he brings them down to help with a peasant uprising. But the Qing warriors have a better idea, and so they overthrow the Ming Emperor and establish control of China. And the Qing create the Manchu, think of Manchuria, the Manchu dynasty that rules China until 1912. And, we'll talk in Unit 5 about what happens then. But the Manchu will be in charge for the next several hundred years. So the Manchu conquest sounds a lot like the Mongols. They remain separate from the Chinese, but they do need help of the Chinese to run Chinese expansion of civil service exams. So again, very similar. They expand territory, they support the arts, and they increase isolation, avoid Europe. Europe seeming to have, aggressive interests and not equal interests. Europe wants to take advantage, and so the Manchu try to stay out of that as much as possible. Have a great weekend.